Welcome to the Donington Park Circuit Guide, everything that you need to know to be fast at Donington Park. This video is brought to you by ourselves at Drivers61 and Race Logic, the producers of the mighty VBox data logging systems. All of the onboard footage in this circuit guide is provided by VBox, and I'm going to be analysing it like I would be if I was coaching on track. Over the years, I've done a lot of coaching with many hundreds of racing drivers, and I always use the VBox data logging systems as it's very easy to use and gives a great insight into drivers' technique. We can use things like the GPS speed, the brake trace and the throttle trace to really understand the characteristics of a driver and how to make them faster. So let's jump into the Donington Park National Circuit Guide. So here we are on board the Group A RS 500 at Donington Park, coming down to the Redgate corner. Quite a late apex here, really easy to turn into this corner too early, but the exit is pretty important as we're heading off down the hill through Hollywood and down into the Craners, one of the more challenging parts of the Donington Park circuit, especially in this change of direction as we're heading down the hill towards the Old Hairpin. Again, quite a high speed right-hander. The exit is pretty important here as we're heading up the hill through Swans and up to McLean's. Quite a tricky braking section of the circuit just here as we're just finishing one corner before we get on the brakes and head into the right-hander of McLean's. Little bit of a crest on the exit there which can sometimes unsettle the car before we head uphill into Coppice. Again, difficult to see the apex of Coppice just there, which means accuracy can be a challenge, but the exit of Coppice is critically important to getting a good run down to the fastest part of the circuit, which is this back straight here, before we get onto the brakes into a medium speed chicane, which is called Goddard's. Grabbing the right amount of curb without taking too much is very important here, and we need to keep the speed high as we enter the start-finish straight. So now we're going to go into a little bit more detail, corner by corner, explaining how we can find time, what the right racing lines are, what we can use as braking references as we go around this lap with Julian. So the first thing to note is that we are using a VBox system. Thank you for those guys for supporting these videos, but we've obviously got the two cameras set up here. You can see here the view of the steering wheel, the gear change on the bottom left here. That's really important for understanding the attitude and the body language of the car. From just looking at the steering wheel, you can really understand whether the car's at the limit, whether it's understeering or whether it's oversteering. We can obviously see the speed trace here and the G-force in this circle on the right hand side here, which is really important as well, and we've got the lap times up at the top. You can also see where we are positioned on the track by taking a look at the GPS data on the track map here, and we're using the national circuit here at Donington, meaning that we're using the chicane rather than the GP loop, as you can see on the map here. So here we are at the start-finish line. I always like to start off these guides by just pointing out where the start-finish line is. You will see that just here, and we've got the lights that you can take note of when you're heading out onto track. First corner, Redgate, is a slow medium speed right-hander. And the first thing I like to talk about is the type of corner and any risks that the corner might have, because that changes how you will build it up to speed in that corner. So imagine we're at a circuit like Silverstone or one of the more modern circuits that has a lot of runoff and tarmac areas on the outside of the circuit. We may want to be a little bit more rapid in how we build up our speeds on the circuit like that, because if we do run wide, if we do make a small mistake on the brakes, we're only going to run off onto the tarmac, and that isn't going to end the session. However, here at Donington, we don't have any of those tarmac runoff zones, and so we do need to make sure that we're building up to pace relatively steadily so that we're not making any big mistakes and running off the road, which could end our session. So Redgate here, it's a reasonably risky corner. It's not high speed, But in terms of running wide, there's only a little bit of grass and gravel on the outside. Now, it isn't dangerous in terms of actually reaching the barrier on the outside. It's actually quite a deep gravel trap. But if we're talking about costing yourself time in terms of the length of your session or what might happen if you do run off the track, then Redgate does pose some risks. So first of all, let's take a look at the approach to Redgate and what we can look at as we're coming down. So the first thing to note is that on the left hand side here, you've got the end of the concrete pit wall. Now, this is by no means a braking point. I don't know any cars that would be braking that early. Maybe some really high power, low grip cars in the wet might be braking up here, but in the dry, I think most cars would make it past that point. More of the braking zones would be around this area here. So we've got the kind of end of the pit wall there on the left, and then coming up here, we've got the start of the green triangle part of the pit lane here. We've got the end of the pit wall, which you can use for a reference. Many cars will actually be braking, I would say, beyond the end of this pit wall here, and you can see Julian is braking at about where the pit wall is here. So if you look at the G-trace on the right hand side here, you will see in fact the red dot moving forwards as he gets on the brake. So he's braking just at, if not just a little bit before the barrier on the left. This is a high power car which doesn't have a massive amount of grip for that amount of power. It's quicker in a straight line than it is around the corners, we could say. So the next braking reference, once we've got past the start of the triangle, is basically the end of the triangle here. Now that is very, very late. Maybe in something low power with a lot of grip and downforce, something like a Radical or a single seater might be braking down here. I've driven a number of Formula One cars at Donington, and the braking point is just beyond the tip of the triangle here. But obviously they slow down very, very quickly. So that's something to bear in mind, but most people will be looking toward the end of the barrier, and maybe you could choose a number of arrows on the left here as to where you start your braking. So braking in a straight line as we're coming down to Redgate here, we should have our vision across at the inside of the corner, our main focus of our vision across here, looking through the corner with a bit of peripheral on the outside here. Slowing the car down, getting down the gears. As you can see from the screen on the left here, Julian is changing down the gears in a straight line, getting it all done before he turns the car into the corner. Now, in this instance, he turns into Redgate a fraction too early. We want to be keeping the car a little bit further out here, a little bit closer to the outside of the corner, but Redgate tends to draw you into the apex. It makes you feel like you want to turn in a bit earlier when actually that isn't the perfect line. So for me, I always feel like I want to turn into Redgate earlier than I know that I should. And I have to wait half a breath past the point where my brain's telling me to turn into the corner and just pause just that half a second before I turn the car in towards the apex. Talking of the apex, we are aiming for these two bollards or the end of this access road on the right hand side here. Now in some categories these bollards will get taken out pretty quickly by people clipping them, so if they do disappear, and don't always rely on these things because they do tend to disappear relatively quickly, make sure that you are focused on the end of this access road on the right hand side, maybe just a little bit beyond it, just in this section, just behind where the car in front of us is. Really smooth when you're getting it on the throttle here, nice and patient because this corner does last for quite a long time. By this point, our vision should be up towards the outside of the track here so that we know instinctively when we should be getting back on the accelerator. Really easy not to be looking very far ahead here, maybe looking down here or maybe at the back of the car in front of us, but actually try and extend your vision through that car so that you know exactly when you should be getting back on the accelerator. Using all the road on the exit here. Now with the new regs since the last time I made one of these circuit guides, we can only run our outside tyres up to the edge of the red and white curbing. We can't go on this area here in the green, and obviously we don't want to be running on the grass on the outside here. Now you may well get away with this a little bit during testing and racing, but You don't want to be pushing the limits too much, otherwise you could get a penalty. Heading down the hill now into Hollywood and getting ready for the craners. In almost every car that I've driven at Donington, this section is flat out and really just a preparation zone for getting the car into the craners. Again, it's quite easy to turn in too early here, which Julian's actually turned in just a fraction early, which then in turn will potentially just push him out and make his job a little bit harder in this area rather than being able to kind of tuck around the next section of track here. So again, just be a little bit patient with turning in. Try not to turn in too early. At this point back here, just keep the car on the outside just a fraction longer, a bit more like the car in front of us is doing, where it's staying out there just a fraction, so that when we get down here, and this is the important part of the craners, this section here where the white line on the right hand side goes straight for that few moments, we want the platform of the car to be flat here. We don't want to still be turning right before we then turn left, because that means the weight of the car will transfer very quickly and it will shock the car. It will make it more likely to slide, and if it does slide, it will make it more difficult to control that slide. So a nice wide apex here, kind of ignore that first curb that we're just passing now and bring the car, tuck it in behind these bollards on the right hand side here. Let the car settle at this point. Let the weight distribution across the axles be neutral for a second before we then turn the car into the left. Now we want our vision to be all the way down here. There are some bollards on the inside, if you can see that far down, and that's what we want to be aiming for. Julian gets there perfectly well. You can see there's two bollards, and even if the bollards go, you can just see here that there's a slight kink in the curb just at this point. So even if the bollards aren't there, you can aim for that kink, and that's where the apex of the corner is. Once we get down into the left here, we don't want to be running too wide in this kind of middle section, the exit of the craners, before we head into the old hairpin. If you're running too wide out here, it's very difficult to get back across the track, and then your turn is tighter for the old hairpin. You'll then in turn lose time in the following section of track, which is a flat out section and uphill. So if you do get a bad exit coming out of the old hairpin, you are penalised all the way through the next section of track. We want the car in this section to be as flat as possible. Take a look again at the steering wheel here with Julian, where we're straight. We will be straight in a second. And the G-force on the right-hand side here. And you can see where he's getting on the brakes. You can see that he's on the brakes now. The little dot is forward. We're on the brakes. We're decelerating. And the steering wheel on the left-hand side of the screen here is straight. And when the weight is distributed across the car neutrally, that means we can use all of the tyres grip for decelerating as quickly as possible. If you have any kind of steering angle in the car here, you're going to be slowing down more slowly than you might do if the car's in a dead straight line. Now the difficulty is this isn't a traditional corner. You can see that we're kind of in the middle of the road here, and the track is kind of moving around where we are and on the approach to the old hairpin. So what you want to do is make sure that you're looking down towards the end of the curb on the left here, just where this car is in front of us, and head straight in that direction. Make sure your steering wheel straight. Let the car rest. Get on the brakes. In most cars, it's a gear or two down for the old hairpin. And so there is a reasonable amount of deceleration that needs to take place here. So we're coming down in a straight line here. You can see that Julian's ended up on the outside of the track here, almost at the end of the curb. I would say that that is about right where we're positioned here. Sometimes if you do come a little bit too far over here, it is difficult to get the car back into the old hairpin. So his positioning was good there. Let's just watch that again. Coming through the left, the platform of the car is flat, we're on the brakes, and then we end up on the outside here. So we've got the old hairpin as open as we possibly can coming into the apex. Even before this point, we should be looking across at the apex point on the inside. If we just take a look at the V-Box camera here, we can see his head. Just watch his helmet. You can see his head moving over to the right hand side as he's picking up that apex in his vision. When you do that, you can see through the corner and you can judge your speed and your racing line much better. So bringing the car into the apex, really hooked up well there, made it to the apex very well indeed. Again, really, you should only be running up to the edge of the curb here, nothing beyond that. But, I mean, a lot of drivers will run onto this green stuff and hope they won't get a penalty or any kind of black and white flag. By the time we get to this point, we should be looking towards the exit of the corner. Again, when we do that, we know we're on exactly the right racing line and we can pick up the throttle at exactly the right point. On another note, you do need to build up your pace all the way down the craners and going into the old hairpin. It's high speed, there's lots of gradient change, which means that the balance in the car is shifting all the way down there. There isn't very much runoff. There's gravel, there's a tyre wall there, and if you do make a mistake here, you go a long way into those areas. Again, Donington Park isn't like a Silverstone or one of the bigger circuits that has lots and lots of runoff. So we do need to build up our pace, especially in these difficult areas here. Getting on the throttle at the right point, coming out the old hairpin is really, really critical. We want to get on the throttle so that the car pushes naturally to the outside of the track. Not do that too early, so we're having to pause on the accelerator, and not do it so late that we're not having to use all of the road on the exit. Either two of those things is going to cost you time, and it's really important here because, as you can see, we're heading back uphill, and even though it's not straight, we're flat out for quite a long time, in terms of Donington at least. So it's going to cost or win you quite a lot of time. Now you can see on the exit here that the edge of the track actually comes back across to us before it kind of kinks and goes straight all the way down here. The exit point is just before. You can just see it in this angle here. You can see that the track kinks. This is the exit point. This section is the exit point. If you're on the curb a bit earlier than that, you'll actually struggle to keep the car on the track because the circuit kind of comes back across at you. So you can see this kink from just before the apex. You can pick it up nice and early, and you can make sure that you are hitting that exit point and having the car naturally push you out on the throttle, so you're getting the best exit possible. Next up, we're coming up to Schwantz curve, quick left-hander. In most cars, it's flat out. There's only been a couple of cars that I've driven where we've had to have a little bit of a lift in wet conditions. You have to be a little bit careful on the curb here because it can unsettle the car, destabilize the car somewhat. So just be a bit careful with that. In the dry, typically it's okay. It's only in the wet that you have to be a bit careful. And the apex point is just after this bollard. You can actually see where all the mud is on the inside here. Not a particularly challenging corner, but in this RS200, you can see that Julian's having to get all the way over to the right-hand side so that he can open up this corner as much as possible. In some higher downforce, lower power cars, you might not necessarily need to get all the way back over to the right before you turn into the left. So up to the next part of the circuit, again, you can see we're travelling uphill. It's a really tricky technical part of the track because we have this left-hander which is really quick, before we then get on the brakes into McLean's. And again, as with a fair few of the corners at Donington, it draws you in to turning into the apex a little bit too early. And if you do that, you've still got too much turning to do once we've passed the apex of the left before you get on the brakes into McLean's. Again, when we go through this next left, we want to make sure that we get the platform of the car as flat as possible for maximum deceleration and keeping the car stable. If you have any kind of steering angle in at this point, you're actually going to be costing yourself a fair bit of time. So you can see here, actually, Julian does turn in a fraction too early. He's moving away from the red and white curb on the right-hand side a little bit too early. And in turn, that could likely push him a little bit too far over to the right. Now, this car's got enough grip in this instance so that he's not actually moving too far over to the right hand side of the track here. If you were to come through here, turn in a bit early, and the car was a bit wider here, so then you were struggling to get back over to the left and you had steering angle in the car when you were on the brakes, then it would become a problem. Or if it was wet, for example, you might be struggling with that. However, I like to try and keep the car out wide along this red and white curb for as long as possible, pretty much towards the end of the curb. You can even grab some of this curb in the dry conditions as well, and that kind of feeds you in from here in towards the apex of the left-hander. So keep the car a little bit wider, a little bit later than you might expect. And then that allows you to get the platform of the car flatter a little bit earlier through this left so that you can get the car straight before you get it on the brakes. The apex is done pretty well by Julian here, probably a little bit early. Could have maybe kept the car over to the left a little bit more, grabbed a little bit more of that curb, so that again we can tuck the car over to the left, get the platform flat and get on the brakes. So if you watch the steering wheel here on the bottom left, you can see that he has got the car in a straight line, getting his gear changes done well before he turns the car into the corner so that everything's nice and stable, and then he turns the car in towards the apex. Now, the entry is pretty good here. Again, notice that we're not using all of this track on the left-hand side of the circuit here. If you do get the car all the way over there, it's very difficult actually to get it back over to the right-hand side to get into the apex. Donington's a very flowing circuit, not as kind of predictable as a lot of the more modern circuits that we see in Formula One, not so many kind of straight lines and straight edges. So that's why we are kind of wandering across the circuit a little bit more than we might expect. So bringing the car into the apex here. Now there are two kinks in the curb here at McLaren's. You've got the first one here, and then you've got a second one. It's the second one that we want to hook up on. You can see here that the bollards, one bollard's been taken down, the other one's still standing, but this is where the apex is in this area here. We want to be hooking that up nice and patient on the on the accelerator, because in this area here there is a slight crest. So if you're already on the accelerator and the car's already sliding and you're powering through the corner just before the crest, when you get there, the rear's going to step out. So it's been the technique in quite a few cars that I've driven is you kind of get back on the throttle and then you pause, waiting for the car to slide a little bit as you come over the crest, and then get back on the throttle a little bit more forcefully once the car settles down afterward. If you're not quite driving at the limit, then you may not feel this crest to that extent, but it is something to bear in mind because I've seen it catch many drivers out. So coming out of the exit of McLaren's here, again, we've got the curbing, we've got the green concrete on the outside here. Really, we shouldn't be using the green concrete. I mean, you might get away with it for a couple of laps, but try to keep the car inside the red and white line here. Julian's doing it perfectly, using all of the track and getting a great exit. Short straight now up to Coppice, one of the most difficult corners on the circuit, and that's because you can't see the apex. We've got an incline as we arrive and you can't see it across to the apex. Now we've got a couple of references that we can use for the braking point. You've got the start of the curb here, and then you've got a changing surface as well. And even if you're braking after the changing surface or the start of the curb here, you can just wait half a breath or a breath before you do get on the brakes, or even use the kind of start of the red and white patterning on the left hand side of the curb here. As we come up the hill, and bear in mind that the car will slow down a little bit more quickly than it might do in other areas of the circuit because we are coming uphill, so the G-force that you feel in your chest will be a little bit stronger than it might be in some of the other areas. Looking across all the way back here, we're looking for that apex, and you have to kind of predict where the apex is because you can't see it. It's even more difficult in a single-seater or a car where you're positioned a little bit lower in the seat. But looking across, and then just as we turn in, you can see the curb and the apex appear on the inside here. So pretty much you have to turn in off memory and feeling, and then just as you turn in, you get confirmation that that the curb and you're on the right trajectory for the corner. Now, one thing to note here is that you can use a bit of this green patch on the inside. However, this first bit of the green patch. If you do try to get a little bit greedy with the curb, the green part is raised above the red and white curbing, and so it can actually unsettle the car somewhat. Don't forget, we've also just come up an incline and we're coming kind of over a crest here. So if you combine that with hitting a bit of uneven curb, it can cause the car to slide somewhat. Quite an easy place to go off here at Coppice as well. So you do want to make sure that you are building up nice and gently to this corner, making sure that you can feel the limit of the car, making sure you can predict where that limit is before you do start pushing that little bit harder. So as we come out here, it can feel at this point that you're kind of in no man's land. You can see here that Julian's got all this space to the outside. The line isn't on the curbing on the outside of here. If you're running out here, you won't make it through the second part of the corner. So he's probably about right with his racing line here. And we've got our vision kind of all the way down, hopefully towards the outside of the track here. It can be quite difficult to see that far ahead and to remind yourself to look that far ahead, but while we've got access to that visual information, we should use it, because this part of the track is really, really important. If you're a little bit late on the throttle, it's going to cost you time all the way down the back straight. So we want to be making sure that you're looking towards the exit curbing, so then you can estimate when you get back on the throttle and how hard you can get back on the throttle. It's really important that you are looking that far ahead. So coming through this section, a lot of cars you don't want to be making this second apex, so if we just head back, but maybe in this RS500, because it's got a reasonable amount of power, we need to square the corner off a little bit more. In a higher power car, you want to square the corner off so that you can get the car straight and get the throttle down, get the power down, so you propel the car down the straight. And in something that's got less power but more grip, you want to make the corner a little bit more geometric, a little bit more rounded, because we want to keep the minimum corner speed as high as we possibly can. So Julian's making that second apex. Some cars you probably don't want to do that, and this is where the OLED display, like a V-Box OLED display, comes in critically useful, is that you can try one line and check the delta, see how it's going, see if you've made some time. Try another line, check the delta on the next lap, and see how it's affected your time and whether you're winning time or gaining time. I inherently have a good feeling for how for what fast feels like and how I get there, but I'm always using the delta display to confirm the feelings that I have, and actually it supplements your learning in understanding what fast feels like, because you can do something in your car, and if you see that delta dropping down, you know and can confirm that that's the faster way to do it, and you learn about the characteristics of your car and how to extract the most speed. So coming up to the exit now of Coppice, you can see all the way back here there's a kind of black piece of curbing, black piece of tarmac, on the outside that you might want to be looking at reasonably early, because that is where the exit point is, all the way up to the curb on the outside of the track here. Obviously we don't want to be dropping the wheel beyond this curb on the outside, because we're going straight onto the grass and we're also going very quickly indeed. So down the back straight now, this is one of the only kind of breaks that you get at Donington. Good opportunity, as I mentioned, to check your delta display, see how the lap's going, see if you're winning or losing any time. Good chance, if you're in a kind of more historic car, to check the oil temperature and things like that, just to make sure everything's okay. And also a good chance to check your mirror to see how the driver behind you is getting on, whether you're moving away from them or whether they're catching you up. This is one of the only kind of overtaking spots at Donington, this back straight going into Goddard and the start-finish straight going into Redgate. So just heading down here, you can see Julian's kind of getting out of the way just to have a look around this car, but we're not going to be able to make that move happen. He's on the brakes relatively early. I think he's just protecting himself from the car in front. You can see from the G spot here that he's beginning to get on the brakes, or at least lifting. But this is quite an early braking spot. So as we're coming down here, again, we want to be looking out for braking references as we're coming into Goddard. You've got a number here that might be relevant in the wet, in something really high power with not much grip. You've got the doors as we're coming down here. and the end of the exhibition centre on the left. So these are really your references. They are a little bit difficult because they are a little bit far away from the track. You know, the ideal braking reference is something that's kind of just here, and it's really easy to be accurate. The further the braking reference is away, the less accurate it is, or the more difficult it is to be accurate with that braking point. But that's the best that we can do here. You've also got the start of the curb on the right hand side here. Now this curb, the entry curb for the Grand Prix chicane, which goes left and right just down here, but you can use that as a bit of a braking reference. You've also got the end of the building here, and where the metal barrier ends and the red and white concrete wall starts. Again, braking in a straight line. You can see Julian's got the car in a straight line going down the gears. By this point, we should have our focus down at the apex, looking all the way down there, long way ahead. That way we can judge the entry speed, we can judge the entry line much better, and our trail braking and so on. And we want to grab as much curb as we can here. You can see the car in front has been a little bit greedy with using all of the track and a bit of the grass. I'm not sure how long he would get away with that, both in terms of kind of getting a penalty here at Donington, also smashing the suspension over the curb here. The problem is that you've got, you know, the red and white curb's smooth enough, it shouldn't damage your car too much. Then you've got something a little bit more aggressive here as the green part of the curb. But then beyond that, the grass gets dug away, and so the lip, as you come back up into the concrete, the green concrete here can be quite aggressive and cause some mechanical issues. So you've got a couple of things that could go wrong there. I've never used that much of the curb there. Maybe this driver can get away with it, but possibly not as well. So always something to consider. But as always, through these kind of medium speed or tight chicanes, you want to be using as much road as possible so that we're opening up the corners and threading the needle through there so that we can maintain a higher minimum speed. So I'd say Julian's got the line about right there. It seems like he's using all of that curb. By the time we get to this point here, our vision should be looking through this car at the apex of the next section, because it's really important that we get on the throttle as early as possible here, so that we can carry the speed down the start-finish straight. Goddard's is a compromise between, you know, this positioning here looks pretty good in the middle of the track here. If you were too far over to the right, yes, you would get a good exit through the left, but you might have taken too much speed out of the car in the previous corner and you'll never win that back. If you're over here on the left a little bit, yes, you would have won a little bit through the first part of this chicane through the right-hander, but then the left is going to be so tight that that you're going to get a poor exit coming onto the start-finish straight. So these things in all chicanes, something to bear in mind. Where's that sweet spot in the midpoint in the corner, where we are on board now? Where's that sweet spot? Where's the compromise? And again, this is something, if you're not sure about, you can work out with an OLED Delta display, because you can try keeping it restricted on one lap, the first part, and opening up the second part. Second lap, you could do something in the middle, and third lap, you could do something where you go in with loads of speed and come out a little bit tighter and a bit compromised. And you can see what differences that makes. Check the delta on the way in, check it on the way out, and see what the difference is. When you're thinking about this, you should think about the straight that follows it. If the straight that follows it is long, then you should restrict the first part of the chicane. So you should restrict this bit because you want to get on the throttle a little bit earlier to slingshot and get out the corner. If it's a short straight afterwards, you're better off gaining some time in this part of the corner, running a little bit wide, making this bit a bit tighter, because the amount of time that you're on the throttle following this section isn't particularly long, and you'll gain much more on the way in than on the way out. Really easy to cheat here, and you will get penalised. There's a marshal's post just up here where they watch you to see if you are grabbing any of this green tarmac here. So be sure not to cheat, and make sure that you are staying within the red and white curb. And one thing to note, just on the exit here, there's a bit of a bump as you're coming out here. Not so much of a problem in dry conditions, but just be a bit careful of it in the wet, because if you've got a high power car, low grip, when you hit that bump, it can unsettle the car sometimes and it wants to spit you off towards the pit wall. So just be a little bit careful there. And again, on the exit here, we've got the red and white curb. There's a little bit of green concrete on the outside, just in case you get on the throttle a bit early and it pushes you out there. But obviously, again, you've got the marshal's post here, and they won't allow you to get away with that for very long at all. One final thing, as we come to the end of the lap here, you've got the pit lane entrance here, in case you need to go into the pits. I would say that if your race has a pit stop in it, when you're coming through Goddard's, make sure that when you come out, when you're coming into the pits, when you come out of Goddard's and you're entering the pits, just restrict this part of your racing line. Keep the car kind of in the middle of the track at least, because the worst thing could be is that somebody sets you up for an overtaking manoeuvre, they come to the inside of you, and then you dive across into the pit lane and you make contact and have a crash. So just be aware of that if you are in a race where it requires a pit stop. Thank you for watching this circuit guide, and thank you to Race Logic for making these circuit guides possible. You can check them out in the link in the description below. If you're looking for more circuit guides, head over to driver61.com and find your favourite track. Cheers, and I'll see you next time.